Good evening. As we've been doing on Sunday nights, we'll do this just kind of like an open Bible class again. If no one has anything to say, I'll just keep talking. But other than that, if you have comments or questions or anything that you think you would like to add, please feel free to do. What we're going to start talking about is fear. And a lot of times when we talk about fear biblically, we talk about the fear of God. That's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about is the type of fear that gets into our hearts and our minds and holds us back from moving forward. We're going to talk about that fear and how it can affect many of us in many different ways, and then hopefully come up with some things of overcoming that type of thing. Obviously, if our faith is strong in God, we're going to lean and trust in Him. But we got to make sure that we are there. Now, the premise of this lesson comes from 1 John chapter 4 and verse 18. And it's one little snippet in there. And it's fear involves torment. Now, prior to that, in the beginning of that verse, it talks about the fact that, love has no fear. And that love's something you can rely on. And the reason it doesn't is because what does fear do? Fear causes us torment. Anyone here ever torment themselves out of fear in this life? Maybe not as an adult, maybe as a kid, maybe as a teenager, but you got so worried about something and how something was going to come that it maybe petrified you. It held you back from moving forward. I remember the first time that I spoke in front of people. I'm telling you, I don't know if anyone heard a word I said. I can remember, as I tell this story before, I remember my first sermon that I attempted to say. It was about 8 minutes long. I remember getting up and I remember sitting down. I can even remember going to sit down right over there. I was in a pew right over there. I remember where I was sitting and where I was standing. But I'll tell you what, I was so scared. Now, you think about that, and if now that I look back on that, I used to think when I was in that position, I told Don Partizano once, I'm never going to stand up in front of someone and speak. You're not going to get me to preach. What are some things that cause us fear? Obviously, I brought that one up because a lot of times people will say public speaking is one of the biggest fears that people have. Yet there's people that do it on a daily basis. But it is a tough thing because you're right there. One thing that I kind of learned as far as like public speaking is sometimes it depends on my mood or how I'm going or how I'm feeling, but sometimes I won't even make eye contact. People might not even notice that because I'm looking here and I'm looking here and I'm looking here, but I won't even focus on if there's something that makes me nervous. I'll just try to keep it that way. And honestly, I have figured out a way to kind of block out the crowd sometimes. But with that being said, obviously sometimes when you're speaking like that, sometimes making eye contact is the right thing. Sometimes you need to engage that way. But the word translated here in this passage, we also find it in Matthew 25 and verse 46. The root word is used in Acts 4 and verse 21, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. Now, I have quite a few verses in this study here, especially when we get to the point where we're trying to look for the comfort and understanding. I didn't even use them all, but there are so many verses and scriptures that you can pull up, that you can read, that will remind you to lean upon God. One that just comes to my mind right now is, it was one we'll look at. It's in Genesis, somewhere in the middle there where Abraham's story is. But it's the time when, a vision comes to him. And the response out of God is, do not fear, I am your shield. So it's that idea, I am your protection. And that's just one example. Go through the Psalms, go through the Proverbs. That's what the Bible, I think, if we really use our hearts and we let the Bible lead us, the Bible is saying, trust God. Put your faith in him, in all that happens. Now, that's not always easy, because one thing, just putting our faith in him, means I'm losing a little bit of control that I think I have. Honestly, do we really have control of anything in this world? I mean, we can make our own decisions. You're not going to catch me winning any rewards for being the best cleaner-upper in the house, okay? But one thing about Christy is, and she made this statement the other day, is just the difference in the way people's minds work. Don't worry, it didn't do anything wrong. It's not a bad thing. But she will start cleaning when she's stressed. And she told me this, and it made me think about this here. And she says it's because it's the one thing I can control. So all the other things with, in life, with work, with kids, with everything, and it was just that idea that that's one way that she finds comfort. And we all find, different things in life that are going to help us through fear, that are going to, but what we really, I think, need to do is we need to understand what it means, what it really means to be afraid. And as I mentioned before, we're not going to be getting into what we've talked about before in the past of the fear of God. Well, we're talking about our own fears, the type of fears that will hold us back. Because if I have a fear for God, is that holding me back from living? Not a biblical fear, anyways. If I'm terrified and afraid, yeah, I'm not. But if I have a reverence, a respect, that fear, then I'm not going to stop. I'm going to take every step I can to please Him. But what we're talking about is the type of fear in our lives that we let. It sometimes comes from sin. Sometimes comes in our lives and we didn't even create it or cause it, but we have to deal with it. And, so that's the type of thing. How do we handle fear? Because, first off, is there anything wrong with fear? Okay, so you're not a big chicken if you're afraid of things? Have you ever heard your big brothers do the bok thing, I remember that a few times. No, not at all. There's nothing wrong with being afraid. It's what we do with it. It's just like anger. Sometimes, it's, Sarah said, sometimes we'll be afraid of something. It'll remind us, hey, I got to be cautious here. I need to, you hear the rattle of a rattlesnake. We don't hear that too much in Ohio, right? But if you're walking somewhere and you hear the rattle of a rattlesnake, like in Texas or something, how many of us are just going to be like, well, I'm just around for my stroll. I'm just going to keep going. I'm not going to worry about it. No, you're going to look, because that rattle means I've seen you and I'm warning you. And there might be a little bit of fear there. Now, fear, someone that comes in front of a rattlesnake could have fear that petrifies them, where they literally don't move. And maybe that would be helpful, because if they didn't move, maybe the snake won't attack. But from what I hear, a lot of times, especially with a rattlesnake, if you hear it rattling, it's already ready to jump. I mean, that's just the warning to say it's probably going to happen. But someone could be petrified to the point where they don't move and then get bit by the snake. Someone else's fear could jump their adrenaline into gear, and they could say, I got to get out of here. And you start running. You take off. So I guess one way to look at this here is, first off, and I have a definition here, and I'll share it with you in a little bit. But without going to Webster or some other dictionary, how would you describe fear? What is fear to you? I mean, you can use a dictionary definition if you have it memorized. You're not allowed to look it up, though. It's a reaction, okay. Yeah, the term scared to death. Uncertainty, okay. Yeah, fear and uncertainty at least go hand in hand. I mean, we don't know what's coming, and that can cause fear. Anyone? Come on, what's joy, right? Happiness? Well, if you guys aren't going to tell me, I'll just give you all the wrong answers. Okay, a reaction to something we feel is dangerous. Like making a mistake. Okay, yeah, yep, absolutely. That's probably one of the biggest things that drives a lot of people. It drives some people to not drive anywhere, because they're so afraid to make the mistake they won't make the move. Yeah. All right, go ahead. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Anxiety is going to work 100% in with this type of, because that's exactly it. Because what happens? We get fear, and it causes anxiety, and then what do we do with that? But the definition here, dictionary-wise, is a distressing emotion aroused by impending danger, evil or pain, etc. Whether the threat is a real or imagined emphasis, or the feeling or condition of being afraid. I like how in that definition it was real or imagined. My mom told me a story the other day. You know, they moved into their new apartment, and they live on a basement sub-level, you know, so they have windows, but they're right at the ground level. And my dad, since he hurt his back, has been in the living room on a recliner. He hasn't slept flat on a bed. So she's in the bedroom by herself. And all of a sudden, it's a little windy outside, but she starts hearing something racking on the window. You know, and she wakes up, and she's an adult, right? So the first thing you think is, okay, it's just a twig or something. It's just it's my imagination. You know, I remember as a kid looking at shadows in my room and thinking it was a monster. I mean, we can play some serious tricks with ourselves. Well, so she's kind of petrified there, and she's telling me that she's seeing this big shadow moving, and so she's starting to think that somebody's trying to break into her apartment. And so finally she said she got the nerve to call out for my dad. And, you know, my dad comes in the middle of the night, and he goes over to the curtain, and he opens it up, and there was a deer eating the grass and kept whapping on the window while it was. So it wasn't anything dangerous at all. I mean, how often, you know, unless you see a big buck with antlers that is charging at you, you know, most of the time you see a deer, it's like, oh, that's a pretty thing right there. But that caused fear and anxiety. You know, imagine what would have happened if she would have just laid there in bed and said, I'm not moving. Then there would have been all that anxiety and all of that stress, and it wouldn't have been worth it for anything. But we do that. I mean, how many times do we see that? I mean, and you know, as far as things like this, there are people in this world that suffer from disorders and things like that, where literally there's people who are afraid of the sunlight. And I'm not talking about vampires. They literally have a fear of the bright lights and the sun, and they will not come out of a house. I forget, it's got one of those long names to it. But, you know, can you imagine that? But really, if you think about it in a smaller scale, when we let fear take over us, in essence, that's what we do. We shut the doors of the house and we say, I'm not going out. And you hope that it's going to pass over. And you know what? Sometimes there are things in life that we can be afraid of that unfortunately with time it will just go away. But what about all that stress when you could have just handled it ahead of time? Yeah, Brent. Absolutely, and that's a fear that there's a lot of folks that they need to sit down and take a look at themselves and say, you know, am I staying home for the right reasons? You know, because there are people that have some conditions, so we're not, but, you know, there are others that they're not really in a risk factor, but they got themselves so scared of it. You know, so that fear is holding them back. Cindy? Right, yeah. 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 Right. Absolutely. And there you had a fear that probably petrified you quite a bit, obviously, if you're sitting on the other side of the airplane. But, right, but you were still facing it, because your biggest concern was, it wasn't that you were putting yourself through the airplane and maybe worrying about something happening to them or whatever, but you were still facing it. And sometimes you have to do things like that, obviously, because, there are going to be things that we're afraid of. There's nothing wrong with showing a child something like that, but an overreaction. Yeah. Well, it's good that you see that. Now, Mike, are you sure? You want to say? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're in the dark, but yet you're coming out with a picture, right? And the negative form of that. Did I have? Thought I saw somebody. Okay, just want to make sure. So, you may have heard this quote before. It was a president of ours at one point, but the only thing to be afraid of is fear itself, right? FDR said that a lot. And, that's the truth. We shouldn't ever look at fear and say, oh, that shouldn't be a problem. Because, really, if you think about it, sometimes those anxieties, you ever stood at the edge of a cliff and kind of felt a little bit, like maybe wobbly or whatever it was, and what is that doing? It's, number one, you don't want that fear to be so much that you hyperventilate and you worry, but it's reminding you, hey, there's not solid, there is no solid ground out there. You fall, so your body has that reaction. But it's, what do we do with these types of things? Now, what about fear? What was the origin of fear? Are we born with fear? I don't believe so. I don't think a baby comes out crying because he's afraid, or he or she's afraid. I think that's something that, as the baby starts to develop, maybe they can learn on their own. It doesn't necessarily have to be something taught. You don't understand something, you can be afraid of it. Yeah, hopefully you don't do it again. But yeah, really, if it comes down to it, I would say the origin of fear came from sin. I mean, that's what it was, because prior to sin, could there have been fear? What would there be afraid of? There was no one getting hurt. There would have been no pain and no sorrow. There wouldn't have been anything to be afraid of. When we go to heaven, we're not going to wake up one day full of anxiety and say, oh, just having one of those earth days. That's the kind of stuff we will have here. We won't have those things there. So what are some things that we fear? It was already mentioned, failure, right? Some people are so afraid of failing that they won't even react. But yet, the wise person is going to realize that in failure, we're going to become better. What was that? Thomas Edison said he didn't make, 1,000 mistakes. He made 999. I forget how he phrased it, but, he just said, there was one way the way he just kept going and kept going no matter what. If one ball wouldn't work, let's try another filament. Let's try this filament. Let's, fill it with this, whatever. But failure, loss of love can cause fear. Dying can cause fear. If we're ready for death, there won't be a fear. But it can cause fear. Think about someone approaching death that just now starts to wonder if there's a God. Serious thought. I think it crosses all of our minds at one point, but, you come to that deathbed and you've had convictions all your life, you're going to start thinking about some of those convictions and say, this is it. How about getting lost? No one ever gets stressed out over that? I just keep driving. I'll find my way eventually. How about losing a child? You want to talk about fear. You want to talk about every bad thought popping in your mind when that child is not in your sight? So I know before I met Christy, Caleb took a nice long walk from his uncle's house across the golf course. And he's what, 3 years old? 4? It was like right before I met her. And I can imagine that fear. He was gone for quite a while. I had a shock when I was home with just Liam and I was working in the barn on a car and I turned around and he was gone. And I yelled his name and I didn't hear anything. But it wasn't nearly as long as that. But, you know, that's fear. But I don't know. To me, that type of fear doesn't hold me back, though. That type of fear gets me motivated. It gets me moving. You know, okay, where was the last place I saw this individual? Where am I? You know, I remember my brother telling me one time that he was traveling for work and he got on the subway in Philadelphia one night and it just happened to be really, really late because of the meetings. And he sat on a subway listening to a group of people down at the other end calling him a cracker and saying all kinds of derogatory things to him. And he just sat there in silence, obviously. But he told me, you want to talk about fear. You got a group of people that outnumber you. That's fear. Loneliness. Is that something that people are afraid of? Sure. There's people that are suffering from loneliness in this congregation that we're missing out on reaching out to. And maybe are sitting in their homes fearful because of that. Maybe they're a shut-in. Maybe whatever it is that's causing that. And then the last one I have, and you may have a list more, there's plenty of other things that we can be afraid of. But change. You know, most of the time we don't like change. Sometimes it's change we're excited, we want to see it. But 9 times out of 10 we get comfortable and we want to stay right where we are. And you know what? Unfortunately, religion has taken a back seat because of a lot of people becoming complacent to it in our country. They don't want to change. There's a lot of people that won't accept Jesus because they don't want to change. Now, it's not necessarily a fear there. But there, you name it. I wouldn't want to put anyone on the spot, but I mean, if I asked, every single person here could probably tell us something they're afraid of. As the world says, men aren't supposed to be afraid or scared or anything like that, right? They're macho, they're supposed to be tough. But one thing that I know my dad tells me all the time that he's afraid of is the generations that his grandchildren are growing up in, and the people that are around them, and how much harder it's going to be for them. So, yes. Not completely. It just depends on the context of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It can work the other way. Absolutely. And I think what you're looking at is 2 different ways of looking at fear. Fear that controlled me and fear that motivated me. And that's why we said in the very beginning, there's nothing wrong with fear. It's what we do with it. It's the same thing with anger. There's nothing wrong with anger. It's how we use it. It's what we let it do to us. And there's so many other things that we could point out and say what we're afraid of. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about prayer in Bible class the one day, and it was brought up the fact that, sometimes people will pray for someone to not die, and then they die, and it's like, oh, my prayers weren't answered. And the person said, well, how do you know the person that died wasn't praying, take me home? I'm done with this stressful life. If I'm done, take me home. So. Yeah. Yeah, she had a hard time there towards the end. She was struggling with her health and everything, and yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and that's why a lot of times when I pray, I pray for them to get better, but I also pray or just give them the comfort and the strength that they need, because sometimes that's the answer. Sometimes that hardship might be what we need, even if it's an illness. Nancy? No. Yeah. Yeah. And there are attachments that can make sense to that, absolutely. But that also goes to show how our fears can change. 20 years ago, did you worry about walking out on the ice and you know what I mean? And that's the thing. It points out that we all have different fears. That's the same thing with these ankles. Usually in the ice, I'm just, strolling along, no big deal. But now, with these braces, every step I take, I am watching where I'm going, where my foot is landing. And that's the thing. Things change, which will cause different fears to enter into our lives. And the question is, what do we do with them? I'll add one more thing here, and then we'll finish. We'll get back into this again next week. Yeah, go ahead, Ray. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That would be a fearful thing. Imagine being somewhere you're not unfamiliar with and seeing someone that coming towards you don't know. And then just hearing it. Yeah. There's all kinds of different things. But then again, there's probably some blind people out there that see better than us. But yeah, absolutely. That would be a fear, 100%. Anyone else? All right, I was just going to add another thing too, just to this idea of the two ways to use fear. We either, have it stop us from going forward, or we use it to motivate us to go forward. And one of the things is, and we'll look at in some of the different stories that we're going to look at through this as far as different individuals that have had fear. For instance, when the angel came to Gideon, and even before the fleece, going to tear down the statue of Baal and everything like that, he was afraid. You could see that. But did that take away from the fact that he did what God asked him to do? No. The fear wasn't wrong. There was nothing wrong with the fear because he still followed through. And maybe the fear motivated him to even follow through with it. But that's the thing. We're not talking about getting rid of fear completely from our lives. That would almost be like saying, I I'm so tired of touching hot things and burning myself, I just wish I didn't feel it anymore. Well, eventually you would smell it then, because your skin would start to burn. But what I'm trying to get at is that anger can be looked at as simply, I think, as a warning to us. Hey, there's danger. There's something happening. Okay, now I know what's coming. What am I going to do with it? Is it something I'm so afraid of that I'm just going to go into a ball and not go anywhere? Or am I going to say, you know what, it doesn't matter. I'm with God, and I'm going to continue through. So just to bring the lesson here this evening, because we could go on for quite a bit longer on this, and we'll continue. This is going to be our Sunday night discussion for, I don't know, next couple weeks, it seems, if the material continues. Next week, we're going to get into the most common words in the Hebrew and the Greek that were used in the Old Testament and the New Testament as far as working towards what we're trying to understand as far as fear. We're also going to hopefully have time to also then start going through the Bible a little bit and looking at some individuals that had fear and different reactions that happened. We're going to talk about, why were they afraid? Why did they react the way they did? Why did they decide, just throwing out there, hey, Abram, who's this lady with you? Oh, that's my sister. Yeah, that's my sister. He only said his wife was his sister because he was afraid of what they were going to do. She's beautiful, and they're going to take her from me and kill me. Well, did that decision decide the life of Abraham? No. He got stronger in his faith and became, the guy that we look to as being a faithful, the man of faith, the father of Israel. But he still made that choice at that time, and that's something that we should look at. I'll mention this one last thing I want you to think about. If you've ever heard someone say, would you denounce Christ if someone had a gun to your head? Now, really, in our day and age, it's very rare in America that that's going to happen, at least right now. Hopefully it never gets to the point where the Christians are worried about walking down the street and having someone ask them that question. So really, and what I want to ask you is something I think that's more relevant to us. And that question is, would you go to your neighbor and talk to them about Jesus? And if not, what are you afraid of? Or why wouldn't you go? Had you already tried and you just weren't going to go again? But I think that's a better way of looking. I think it puts the same point across. Not quite to the extreme, but if you stop and you think about it, if my life is on the line, that's a completely different extreme than someone just putting me down because I'm a Christian and they don't want to hear it. Because that's a lot of times what we're afraid of, is no. I don't want to hear what you have to say. Why would you share that with me? So we want to look at those things, and I want you to, think about that this week. Think about that scenario, because I'm sure you've heard someone say, what would your decision be if someone stuck a gun to your head? I'm not there. I would hope that my last decision would be no, but really, things that affect us. What is it that scares me from being a Christian? What holds me back from doing the right things in this world, to letting my light shine, whatever it may be, if there's something that you think. But that's what we're trying to get at here in this lesson. Number one, fear is real. Number two, fear is not necessarily wrong. It's how we use it. And really, I think the most important thing is, why should we be afraid of anything when God is there holding us? And I think the unknown, as Nancy said, may be part of that problem, because sometimes it's not so much I don't trust God, it's am I going to like the answer I get? Russ? Yeah, that definitely could be a fear that holds us back. Yeah. So think about some of this week, and next Sunday we'll get back into looking at some of the other things that I said we're going to look at here. But think about that. And I think sometimes as adults we don't always think of fear. You know, we think, oh, I was a kid, I had fear. But we just have different fears. You know, we're not sitting in our bed at night looking at the coat rack wondering if it's a monster. Because we put the coat rack there, we know what it is. But there are other things that we're afraid of. Are we afraid to stand up for Jesus? You know, or are we afraid to stand up? You know, one of the things that I love the most is anytime that I hear a young kid stand up at school for someone who's being bullied. That's one of the, I hate to hear that someone's being bullied, but when you hear a young kid that is willing to stand up in front of the crowd, in front of their peers and say, this is wrong in a situation like that, that's how we should be as Christians. I'm going to go do what was right, and it doesn't matter what you have to say. I'm going to leave you with that. If there's anybody here this evening, though, that has any prayer requests, we give you that opportunity with the invitation here. We're going to have the invitation song and then the closing prayer. So if there's anyone that does need prayers, just come up and we'll talk and we'll make sure that we'll put them into the closing prayer. All right. If there's anyone here that has any need, please come forward as we stand and sing this.